Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll start the Zevachim daf Hey. We're going to begin on Hey Amud Aleph, the third line from the top. So we've been learning in yesterday's daf, first of all, that when it comes to the four avodos, it's necessary that it has to be a lishma, and it cannot have what's called a shinoi kodesh. When it comes to different carbon, it has to be specifically for that carbon. And we also learned shinoi baal, that when you have the machshava, for example, shchita, during the time of the shchita, you cannot have the thought process that I'm going to eventually do the zrika for someone else. And on this, the Gemara continues based on the two psukim that we saw that teach us that when it comes to most karbanos, let me just say it that way, based on our Mishnah Daf Beis, if you have this improper machshava, when it comes to the wrong carbon, that the Mishnah says it's kosher, but it's not oil l'shem chayva. So on this, the Gemara says as follows: Rami Reish Lakish. So he asks a question, al moihi bein midrasha umakshi. So literally on the stomach, in the base medrash, he asked this question. It says Rashi, Sheichev al bitnai. Panav klapi karka. He was like lying on the ground. I'm not exactly sure the significance of why he did that, but this was his question. In ksherim heim yirtzu, certainly got someone's attention. He says it doesn't make sense. If in fact, even though you have the wrong machshava, the Mishnah says it's kosher, so it should therefore work for the Baal. Vim ein meratzin lama boyin. So I guess that's like what he was maybe demonstrating while he was lying on his stomach, that if it doesn't work for the owner, then what's the whole purpose of bringing it to begin with? Says Rashi, apparently he didn't learn out from the pasuk, which we've actually quoted a couple times already. So we find that even though it may not seemingly have a real purpose for the person, nonetheless, we still sometimes bring the carbon. For example, achar misa. Shechein ksherin, that's kosher, but ain't meratzin. But it's obviously not maratza because there's no kapara for someone who's died. Says Rashi, v'afata al tetamel elu. Don't ask a question on this because we find this elsewhere. How do we see this? Did none, because we learned in perhaps some Masechtas Menachos. So it says Isha shehavia chataso mesa. Let's say you have a woman who just gave birth, so she has a chiyuv to bring karbanos, and she brought the carbon chatos, and then she dies. So yaviu yarshin oilasa. So the yarshim are allowed to bring the oila. Now it has to be that way. But oilasa, she brought the oil of a mesa, lo yavi yarshin chatasa. We don't have the yarshin bringing, because as we saw before, by a yachid, it's the din of chatas shemesu baleha that we say that the carbon is lamisa azla. So that obviously isn't the case. However, let's say she brought the chatas, but she didn't bring the oil yet, so the relatives can bring the oil. Now the question is, what's the purpose of bringing that ola? She's already died. So what's the significance? There's a chiyuv to have to bring a carbon, ola, but we still bring it anyway. The yarshim can have it brought. So even though it doesn't really accomplish anything, so too over here, even though it's true, it doesn't accomplish anything, you can still bring it. So it's not a question. We see this happen. So I'm going to one second. I can understand if she didn't bring the ola, that the yarshim can bring that, the isla achamisa, that can be brought. But asham, over here, we're including an asham. How do we know when it comes to an asham that the din is that it can also apply, that it can still be brought? So again, let's say you have an asham or shechted shalashma, so it's not maratza, but nonetheless we say you could still bring it. Now, Rashi says, v'asham mihu delo asil achamisa kaimul nechol shebachatas mesa bashim raya. As we're going to pick up on this, that when it comes to a person who died, so the din is that chatas is that animal's killed. However, when it comes to an asham, we allow it to graze, and then it develops a mum, and then we can take that money and we can use it ketzal mizbeach for like an oila. But how do we know, therefore, that that's something which should apply? So, minolan dekar shalishman hoya ve'in maratza do apik tanmasnisin el pesach v'chatas. So our Mishnah only excludes pesach and chatas, but asham should be included too and be possible. Again, obviously it's a machlokas in our Mishnah. So Ramoi Hari machlokoscha b'sidai. You have a machlokas on your side. Our Mishnah actually does say to support you that maybe you're right. Maybe an asham is not brought because of that logic. So Zehu she'aymin alav adam gadol. This is a person who's an adam gadol. Kamino na Mishnah shleima v'yad amrit li Rabbi Eliezer. You're right. I can understand Rabbi Eliezer opinion, but how do we understand the opinion of the Tanna Kama? The Tanna Kama makes a distinction between a chatas pesach and an asham. They allow the asham. So how do you understand the Tanna Kama? Okay, fine. I understand that you found support to the logic of why I'm saying that, but why doesn't everyone agree to it? So literally you've created like an opening for yourself, basically again asking why is it being brought, and the answer is because the pasuk says so basically we saw already the pasuk which says that even though it was supposed to be a neder, you had the wrong machshava, so you can still be brought as a nedava. So we see that when it comes to a neder and nedava, it can still be brought. Obviously, you still have to bring another carbon because it wasn't properly done, but nonetheless, it's still kosher. And it's kosher that, in other words, it still works. There's not oil l'shem chayva. So we see by neder nadav it works. Okay, so hopefully he's satisfied with that. Yosef Reb Zer, Reb Yitzchak, Borab, Yosef Abaye, and Gabayu. Yosef Kami, they were sitting and engaged in this discussion, this question and answer format of Reish Lakish. So Kashli Reish Lakish Asham. So Reish Lakish asked a question about an Asham that Delo Asi Lachamisa, that if in fact after the person dies you cannot bring it because the din is it's Ba'asham Raya, B'Natzel Talmuda Maitzas Vasecha, and you end up answering him based on a neder and a dava. Okay, fine. We see when it comes to an ola by the woman, right, who died, okay, an ola can be brought. We see that when it comes to a neder and a dava, okay, a neder and a dava can be brought. But how do we see this by an asham, right? Ema haba b'neder and a dava leisi v'lo yirtzi. Maybe only when it comes to a neder and a dava that's the din, but asham leisi klal. Maybe when it comes to an asham, you don't bring it at all. So again, why does our Mishnah say, according to the Tanna Kama, that you could bring it? So Armul Hu Abaya Reish Lakish Mahacha Pasach. From here, one is able to open. So let's look at the pasuk. The pasuk says V'samach es yadai al roish chatos, that you did the smicha on the head of the carbon chatos, which is what you have to do, smicha. V'shachad isa l'chatos. And then you shecht it, b'makam asher yishchatas oil, in the same place where you shecht an oil, and the chatas is also brought, as the Gemara elsewhere says that it shows to not embarrass the person who brings the chatas, that people are not going to know that he sinned. They'll think, oh, maybe he's just bringing oil. So b'shachat oisa, over there it says you shecht oisa. Why does it say that lashon? L'chatas only for the chatas. Oisa l'shma kshera sh'lo psula. Now, when it comes to a carbon chatas, it has to be done for a chatas. For shlosh shmos pasul. So hashar kadshim. But when it comes to apparently all other karbanis, including an asham, shlosh shman ksherin. So we see from here, takas kosher. So you're right. Maybe your logic should show that there's no reason why you should be able to bring it. But we find Exersa Kasav that tells us that only when it comes to a chatas, it's only allowed to be brought when it's lishma, but otherwise it's not allowed to be brought, which is mashma. When it comes to other karbanos, including asham, it can be brought. So yachli yiratzu. So maybe you would think that not only can it be brought, but it even will be maratza for the baal. So Moitzas Abosecha, that pasuk is coming to tell you that again it could be brought out on the dove, it can be brought as a nedava, but you still have a chiyuv to have to bring the dead there because that was what was Moitzas Abosecha was as a neder, so you still have to bring it. So the ema hababa neder of a nedava leis maybe only when it comes to the neder nedava. It's not maratza. Asham rutzi nami lirtzi. Maybe taka an asham. Now that we've already established that it can be brought, right, so, and it's kosher. So why don't we establish that it's oil l'shem chayv, l'shem bal? So Rabbi asham de maratzi, to say that it actually works and it's perfectly fine. Lo masas. That doesn't make sense. You can't say that because think about it. Kavachaymer ma'oila. What do we see as a kavachaymer from an oila? Ma'oila she'ena machaperes ena maratza. So when it's done shalol shma, it's not mechaper and it's not maratza, and that's by an oila because it doesn't achieve kapara. That's not the purpose of an asham, and it's not maratza. So asham shemechaper. So an asham, its purpose is to be mechaper. Maratza. How can you possibly think that's going to be maratza when you need it to achieve kapara? So therefore, there's no way you would want to think that taka it would work. It would actually work l'shem bal. So 1 second, you're telling me that from alta kavachaymer from oila that it doesn't work. So 1 second, mal oila shechin kalu. So when it comes to an oila, you can't compare it. An oila is completely burnt on the mizbeach. So how can you compare that to an ola? So shlomim yechichu. We can maybe use a shlomim to disprove that because a shlomim, as we know, is not kolil, but nonetheless it has the same din. So we can see that even though it's not kolil, it should work. Yeah, we have mal shlomim shechein tun in the sachem tunufas chasar shaik shlom, as we said, as opposed to ma'is behemer or bechor, other kadosh and kalim. It has numerous stringencies that it requires libations and wave offerings of the chaz of a shaik, as opposed to the asham. So oil teichiach, because the oil doesn't require those things either. So clearly the chazar din lo rizeh krizeh, lo rizeh krizeh. We see that an oila has certain stringencies that a shlomim doesn't have. A shlomim has certain stringencies that an oila doesn't have. So those two separate karbanos, those stringencies are not linked to the reason why they're connected. So therefore, Hasad Shavashimehen, we look at what is the same when it comes to an ola and a shlomim. What is that? Hasad Shavashimehen, Shein Kadshim, Vishachten Shalashman Ksher Ve'in Maratzin. That we already know when it comes to an ola, and we didn't have any questions about an ola, we didn't have any questions about the or about a shlomim, because they could still be brought, as we said, right? They could still be brought even after the person died, like the woman died. You can still bring an ola. So, but we see it's not maratza, obviously. So afani avi asham shehu kaddish v'shachtu shalashman kosher, the eno maratza. So we can learn out from a sad hashava from ola and shlomim that so too, that from an ola and a shlomim that so too an asham is not maratza. Now 1 second, mal sad hashava shemehen shechein yishabat sibor, that an asham is a carbon yachid. When it comes to a shlomim and an oila, they're karbonos sibor. So, what do you mean? Where do we see it's a carbon sibor? So Rashi says, shlomim yishlam sibor by kisei etzeres. When it comes to on Shavuos, the shnei kfasim that are brought to accompany the shtei halechem, the din is that, well, that's obviously sibor, and that's a shlomim. The kisei etzeres has a status of a shlomim. An oila, of course, is a tzibor carbon, right? Which is why we said an oila is a zachar by nature, because a carbon tzibor has to be a zachar, a male animal. But anyway, we see that. But when it comes to an asham is always yachid. So you can't compare through a sada shava ola and shlomim to an asham. So toida techiach, because a carbon toda is also an individual carbon. It's a carbon yachid, and again, it's not oil l'shem chayva. Back to Ham and Beis. Yeah, 1 second. But toda is different, because mal toida shachin tu nelechem. When it comes to toida, it requires the 40 breads, which is not something which is the same one an asham doesn't require. Yeah, but ola the shlomim yochichu, because those don't require 40 breads. We don't accompany an ola or a shlomim with breads, we only do that by a toda. V'chazra din. We see that these three things have different stringencies. An ola is kolil, it's completely burnt. A shlomim is something in which requires tenufa, chaziv, shaik, and when it comes to the taida, it requires breads. But those three things don't apply to the other ones. One doesn't apply to the other two, and vice versa. Nonetheless, they have something in common. So we can learn and you can't say, well, 1 second, but it's those are carbon sibor, because a toda is a carbon yachid. All these different three things can be brought as a neder or a nedava, which again goes back to that pasuk, which is not when it comes to an asham. An asham is not the status of an neder or nedava. So therefore, even though an ola, a shlomim, and a toda could be brought as like a free will offering, an asham is when you sinned, you have a guilt offering that you must bring. El omerava, so you can't answer it that way. So how do we know again what the din is by an asham? So because the pasuk we had also in yesterday's daf, Zois HaTorah, V'Goymer, and the pasuk which is kedai to repeat, L'oila, Mincha, Chatas, Asham, Limuyim, L'Zevach HaShlamim. So we have Asham in this pasuk together with all these other kabbalas. We use this pasuk right to tell you that we went up from Shlamim to all the other karbanos. That again, there's Shinei Baalim is a problem. So we can learn out from here that he kishu kasav l'shlamim, ma shlamim, as we already said. But what we already learned out from shlamim, shehin kadashim v'shachtan shalashim ksherim v'ein maratza v'afnei asham shu kaidesh v'chulu. So therefore, we can actually learn out not from the sadashah but from this pasuk. So the Gemara says like this. So my chazis the akshis l'shlamim. Why do you want to start off by learning out from shlamim? Akash l'chatas. Why don't we learn out from a chatas? Because a chatas doesn't work at all. Why are we trying to say an asham, according to the Tanakhama, of course, is more like a shlamim? Why don't we say it's more like a chatas? It says, Hamid Rachmana Osa. Because the pasuk it says, the samach hashjado el rosh chatas, that you do the smicha on the chatas, dafka, the shachat Osa, and you shecht it, l'chatas, as a chatas. So since it says Osa, so that's coming to as a miyut, and therefore because of that, we don't learn it out to teach us the din of an ola, of a chatas, but rather compare it more to a shlamim. Simon hanash basar Yosef Rav Huna Rav Nachman Yosef Rav Sheshes Gabai Yosef Kamri Kashali Reish Lakish Asham. So he had this original question about why do we say that the asham is kosher, but it is not ol shem chayiv? Like, what's the purpose of it then? Delo asil acher misa. So he said that because the problem is that when it comes to an asham, like a chatas, you can't bring the chatas afterwards because it has to be killed. An asham cannot be brought; it has to graze. So leimale Rebbe Lezer asham nami asil acher misa. It's not true. Why don't we say that asham taka is brought after Misa? Why? So let's see if Rashi says this. Because she'ashim shemesu balahel roya v'dam of noifon l'ketzim mizbeach. It's not true. It is brought on the mizbeach, not the carbon itself, but it grazes. You take its value, and that money of the value of that animal, you buy another animal, which is a tamim, and you bring as an oil. So what do you mean? It is brought. It is brought. Shermahu Rav Sheshes Asham L'may Karav. What exactly is being brought over there? It's L'maisroi. It's the leftover, the money. It's not, or the redemption. It's not the animal itself. So Chatas Dami Mikra Karva Maisra. So why don't we say Taka that when it comes to a Chatas also you can be makri of the leftover money? No Chatas Afagav the Karva Maisra. You're right. When it comes to the leftover money, mid rachmana hu. So Hashem nam because of lehu. So ahu le'achar hakataris imorim hu dechsiv. That pasuk, the word hu, is written only to tell you it's referring to after the hakataris imorim. Kidesanya. Aval asham lo nemer bo hu. Aval le'achar hakataris imorim. V'hu atzmo im lo hakdir imorim kosher. That if you were not makri of the sacrificial parts, it's kosher. Velahu lamali. Okay, let's slow down. Let's go into Rashi. We may have to do these next few lines again. So, Rabbi, let's look at the top, toward the top of Rashi. It says, the chatas nami maestro in the dabahu. The leftovers is in the double. What does that mean? So this is a different situation. Hifr shtei chatois lachrayis. You're makri. You said designated 2 carbon chatois with achrayis. Mischaper ba'achas mehen. So you already received kapar from one of them. This is not mesu ba'aleha. This is mechaper ba'aleha. Vashniya teiraya. So the din is because you had intention both of them at the same time, and obviously you can't bring 2 karbanos. You brought one. The second one is grazed. But he krivel achamisas balim. And you can makriv it after the death of the guy. Sharing ischaper b'chaver to b'chayev. He already achieved kapara with the original animal in his lifetime. Ve'enzu chatash shmesu ba'aleha. This is not a case of chatash shmesu ba'aleha, because chatash shmesu ba'aleha means that the guy never brought a carbon, and therefore, if the guy never brought a carbon chatos and he died, then we do not require him. We don't allow for that carbon to be a chatas anymore. We allow that the animal just has to die. However, this is not that case. This case, the guy did achieve kapara because a chatas was brought, but he designated 2, and therefore the second one is grazed. Alma asya chatas la'achar misa. We actually find also when it comes to chatas that it's after misa. V'yafil hachi psula shalashma yashem nami lifsol. So since this animal was like an insurance, like having the second animal just in case, so therefore we also find by a chatas is the same thing. So now let's go back in the Gemara. So he says like this. So lemli Rabbi Lezer Asham nami asil achamisa. So he said, what do you mean Asham? So lamai karav lamaisra. So chatas nami mikrav karav lamaisra, right? So chatas also in that particular situation, where he already achieved kapara from one of the 2 animals, and the second one we actually graze, and we are allowed to use that money. So he said chatas afagav de karav lamaisra. It's true, even though typically you are allowed to do this, right? That you're allowed to, because it was a second animal, but mid rachmanahu. However, the pasuk says regarding, let's look at all these Rashis. Sa'ir nasi. When it comes to the king who has a chiyuv to have to bring a sa'ir, so as we saw in Masechtas Horius, the shachan oisa b'makam asher yishchat has oila lefnei Hashem chatasu shchatenu l'shem chatas. The imam apostle. It says it must be brought for a chatas, and if not, it's apostle. Dehu mashma b'viyasiyeh. Ima v'yasiyeh kashim imam apostle. It has to be lishma, right? So we learn out when it comes to a chatas, it must be lishma, and otherwise it's apostle. So it's true. On one hand, we do find a chatas situation where it works after misa, like we said, if you have designated 2 animals, and then you already were makar of one while you were alive, and therefore you achieve kapara. So now the second one, which is just like was an insurance policy, but you already had the chatas and the guy dies, then we allow it to graze. But so it's not a normal case. That's not a typical case of chatas shmesu ba'aleha at all. But nonetheless, even though we do allow that, we also find that it's possible of l'shol shma. So now let's see the Gemara. So Ashim nami ksiv behu. It also says who, says Rashi. B'tzavis aron v'hekdiru hamizbech ishel Hashem Ashim hu. So b'zman shu l'shem Ashim kashim ilma apostle. So we find clearly from the word who the same thing that is apostle, right? So that should be the end of it. You say no. When it says the word who, that's only talking about la'achar haktaris emorim. Says Rashi, you can't allow from that, but rather it's just come to tell you, as Rashi says, it's not telling to tell you that when you're maktir it's ma'akev. Dehu atzmo shel hukturu imorim kosher, because if you were not maktir the imorim, you're still kosher. Dein kapar el badam. The kapara is through the blood, not through the sacrificial parts. So therefore, who comes to tell you that achar akataris imorim, that after you were maktir the sacrificial parts, could assign, now say the Gemara, of asham lo nemer bohu, but asham it doesn't say who el haktaris imorim. It's only come to tell you this din when it comes to these the din by the sacrificial parts, but it's not coming to tell you anything about who. Therefore, it has to be lishmor, else it's possible, like by achatas. But who atzmo imo hiktiru imurin kosher, because when it comes to, as I said, by an asham, if you are not even makre of the sacrificial parts, it's kosher, because the zrikas adam is what's ma'akev. That's what achieves kapara, not the sacrificial parts. Velahu lamuli. So then, what is who coming to tell you? Now, it can't be coming to tell you that it's the imorim or ma'akev, because we know they're not. Rather, Rav Huna Omer the Rav Huna Omer asham shenitik l're'iyah. Let's say you have a carbon asham in which, because the owners died, or for example, they already achieved kapara. So what you do is you need to allow it to graze, and as I said, it needs to, once it grazes, that's a mum. Then you could take that money, and then you will take that money and purchase for Ketzel Mizbech. Now v'shachtu stam, but you took this animal which was removed for that sake, but you shechted it as a carbon, so it's kosher. Now, which is pretty amazing. That even though it was already removed for that sake, we say that it's kosher as an oil. Now, the diak is nitak in, lo nitak lo. My time omer kra hu b'yasu yehe. So the drasha is that it's only when you actually designated it. It says Rashi nitak in dimi akir sham asham mine. You basically removed its status for being an asham, because it was an asham, but since, let's say, the owner died or there was already a kapar achieved, to designate it already for it to be grazed, even though it hasn't developed a mum yet. But you've already removed its status of being an as an asham. So then, if you shecht it as an ola, then it works, even though you're really supposed to wait to let it get a mum, but it's still kosher. However, in the situation where it was not nituk and it still had the status of an asham on it, then it would not work as an ola. So they slaughtered it for an ola, which is what we would have brought eventually anyway for an oila as Ketzel Mizbeach, but only once it was removed. But if it was not yet removed as an asham yet, from being an asham, then it would be possible. Okay, let's take a breather for a second. There's a lot to unpack. Let's look at question 7. Why didn't we learn out ba'asham v'hikter oisam hakayin asham hu? Why don't we learn out question 7 from who? The lishma ma'akev, that it's ma'akev kederech shalamdu minechsev hu b'chatas. Why couldn't we learn out just like chatas is ma'akev and it's not lishma, it's possible? So because that who is written by haktaris imorim. It's specifically written by the bringing of the sacrificial parts. And we know that when it comes to haktaris, the haktaris are not even ma'akiv. Even if you don't bring them at all. Questions on why don't we learn out bila, right? Okay. But regardless, that's how maybe that's a side question. But the point is that what we're basically saying is that this word who is talking about the part of the sacrificial parts, but we know it's not ma'akev. So if you didn't have the right machshava, so also obviously it shouldn't be a problem. So you can't learn out from who from there. Okay. Man nilman mahu hakosab asham. So Taka, what do we learn out from who? It tells us the choshul nitikoriya that if you took this asham, again, where the owner died or there was kapar achieved, so therefore the asham cannot be brought, we have to let it graze. But if you did not yet set it aside to be grazed and you shechted it stam, it's possible because it's still considered as a shame oila, shame asham. However, once you allowed it to graze, then and you shechted it, even though you're supposed to allow it to get a mum, and then eventually use that money for an ola, it still works as an ola at this point. Okay, let's look at question TA 15. You can understand, like, there's a lot of information to remember for a 30 blot test. Reish Lakish, Hikish ba'ashim sheshachta shalishma im ein maratzin l'lam aboyin. So why do you have to bring it if it doesn't even work? So v'hainu d'lo matzinu ba'ashim sheboyin bein maratzin. We never find by an asham that you can bring it and it's not maratzin. U'maskanas rabba madua be'emes iyevshel limoid shemaratzin. Why is it impossible to learn that it works? Madua ein lamin mechatas t'psulin. Okay, it's a really long, hard question. So you can't say when it comes to an asham it's maratza because we went out the pasuk of Zayis HaTayra. Okay, in fact, when we make a hekesh, all the karbanos together, just like asham to shlomim, the shlomim, we said it's kosher, but it's not oil shem chayva. So too when it comes to the asham, and it's not pasul because the pasuk says osa. So osa is coming to exclude an asham. So that's what we said over here. Harachmana, hamid rachmana osa. So when it comes to that pasuk, it's coming to exclude an asham. Let's see, what does it say here? This is question 15 again. Enu nifsal dechseb b'chatas osal mute asham. Only when it comes, right, osa, which is only by a chatas, which I saw the pasuk is the chatas, but not for an asham. Okay, what does Rabbi Lezer do? Who disagrees with us in the Mishnah? Okay, something to think about. TB 17. Reish Lakish asks a question about asham sheshashulishmam behind the lumatzinu ba'asham shein. There's a maskana madua ein lebden maratzin madua ein lebden psuon. So it's exactly the same question, but still not an easy question. Let's see if I got this right more recently. So b'glal shehu shinui kodesh l'maratzin. Okay, I mean I wrote a little bit of it correct. So first of all, it's Zayis from Zayis HaTayra. Mishlomim l'asham. So that's how we know that it is right? And then why can't we learn from chata? So ein loy med psulin. So b'chatas ksiv osa lif soil shlo lishma v'lo asham. It's very hard, but that's the answer. I got a lot of these questions wrong. Okay, that was TB 17. Okay, all right. Let's finish this daf. Okay. So Yosef Rav Nachman of Rav Sheshes, Yosef Rav Adam of Ramasna, Gabai Yosef Karmer, Hadikam Rabbi Lezer Metzina B'Boyin Lachar Misa, Shenk Sharon. We find that after Misa, it's still kosher in Maratzin, and it's not Maratza. So Lemli Reish Lakish Hanu Nami Leisno Yirtzu. Why don't we say? Let me see. Did I skip anything here? No. Why don't we say that it's Maratza for the Yorshim, right? So, again, these Yorshim, L'chaira, who brought it, so why don't we say that it's Maratza for them too? Let's say, for example, this carbon is something which they could have benefited from, so they also needed to bring this carbon, so let it be Maratza for them too. So, but we say they could bring it, but it's not Maratza. So, Rabbi Bar Masna, Yoiledes, if we're talking about a woman who, again, she has to bring a chatas and an oil. She brought a chatas, which she has to do, and then she died. So the oil can be brought by the Yorshim. So if that's true, im hi yolda, she's the one that gave birth, and then she died afterwards. But now mi yoldu, did her kids give birth? So how could it be a ritzui? They didn't even give birth. The whole purpose of this ola was because of her birth. So what exactly are you talking about? So Maska Baravasi Uman Lemulan Di Ika Kama Ase Gaba Lomas Capra. Who says that, let's say there's not other things that require this carbon, that a kapara would not be achieved? Says Rashi, Doledis the lo mechapra oilasa olayhu im havia mechayim. Oil mechaperes alasei ve'aloisa se shenitik lasei. We know that a carbon oila can be mechaper for an asay or lav hanitik lasei. So maybe, says Rashi, ha'ein oila ba el al asay ve'aloisa se shenitik lasei. In other words, maybe if she would have brought this carbon for another thing also, that would have achieved her kapara. Kivan dechi ika kama say, if she did other sins, gaba mechapra, so that one ol would be mechapra for other things. So your shehanami mechapri, maybe the Yorshim also did some type of an avera, some type of an asay, or violated a lav nitik asay. So why don't we say it works for that too? So memra. The Kanyilhu, you're giving me the impression that the Yorshim actually are kaina this kapara, this carbon, in order to achieve kapara. The Yom Rav Yochanan, Haniach mincha l'shnei banav. Let's say you left over a mincha offering to two of your kids, umeis, so kriva. So you can be makar of it. The ein bo shutvas. They do not have a partnership in this. What does that mean? So Rashi says, because when it comes hakoyel ba b'shutvas, everything is through a partnership. Lo silka kasav el mincha shenemer bo nefesh. When it comes to the din of a mincha, it says nefesh, which means only one person can bring a mincha. It cannot be b'shutvas. So how do we understand in a situation where you have two children that acquire something, kriva v'ein bo shutvas, we say they can be makar and there's no shutvas. Because if it was shutvas, then you couldn't bring it. The question is, how could they be kaina this carbon? Nefesham rachmana. So the point is, so how are Yorshim able to bring this carbon? Right? These Yorshim will be like shutvin if they own or they're kaina this mincha. But if that's the case, they should be allowed to bring it because the pasuk says nefesh. Only one person can bring a mincha offering. So it's a proof that they're not kaina, that the Yorshim are not kaina. Just because they're able to bring it doesn't mean that they're kaina. So if they're not kaina, why would you think that if the Yorshim bring this oila, that it should actually work for them to be able to achieve some type of a kapara for their own actions? They were not kaina it. So you're telling me that therefore if they're not kaina it, so they shouldn't be able to bring. What you tell me they're not kainit? Let's say you leave an animal for your two kids, umeis, and you die. Kriva, it can be makar of it. The ein mamirin ba, but there's no din tamura on it. Now iamrit bishlo makanyilahu hanu ein mamirin ba dahavilush kashutvis. When it comes to shutvin, there's no din tamura on partnerships. The whole din of tamura, of the exchange of one kedusha to another animal, is only in a situation of a yachid, but not by partners. So the question is, how would this work? That it says that the ein mamirin ba. So it says there's no din tamura. Why is there no din tamura? It's only the one guy that died. It belongs to him, and the children are not yarishit. So then there should be a din tamura. So why is there no tamura? Because it is shutvas. So we see actually you are kainit, right? The ein mamirin ba the having lo kishutvin. As we continue the Baba Aleph, the shutvin loy matzah mamirin. So eli yamrit lo kanya. But if you tell me therefore it's not kain, so if it's not kaina lahu amr namu limru, they should be able to do tamura on it then. So apparently we see taka that you are kainit. So how do you understand this? By the mincha, it seems like they're not kainit, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to bring this mincha, because only nefesh could bring. But nonetheless, when it comes to this, it says there's no din tamura, so it must be because they are kainit. So shani hasam diyamakra, it's actually different over there because the pasuk says, and I'm going to read the whole pasuk, lo yachlifenu lo yomero. So this is by tamura. Toiv Rabba Rabba Toiv. V'im hamer yomer behema bebehema, if you do a tamura on it, v'yehu tamurasu yeh kodesh. So you wanted to maybe transfer the kedusha from one to the next, but the truth is, it does transfer, but the kedusha still stays on the other one. So im hamer yomer lo ramos as a yerish. So the pasuk over there is just a reboy to include a yerish, even though it's true that echad meimer ve'en shnayim amirin. One person can do tamura, but two cannot do tamura. So even though when it comes to a yarish is really maybe not kaina. However, there's just a gzeres kosev that it includes that when it comes to yarshim, there's no din tamura. But the truth is, technically speaking, you would think because they're not yarish, so therefore you would think they should be able to do tamura. But the pasuk says there's a gzeres kosev that it's coming to exclude these yarshim, that they, even though they're not kaina, nonetheless there's no din tamura. Why? Says Rashi, the entire pasuk is lashon yachid, and it's different. Afagav the lo kanyil hu gzeres hakosavu the shnei yarshin in mamirin zos nefesh avihen. Okay, so that's the answer. Okay, maybe there's another question over here. Question 8, no, Adkan.